Module 7, Language. Language is symbolic. Words are arbitrary symbols with no inherent meaning. So they're like codes that represent a meaning that was agreed upon by a group. It can be a language, for example. It can even be what a set of icons represent. There are rules about language. We can have phonological rules, how words sound or pronunciation, syntactic rules, the way they're arranged, so word order, semantic rules, that's about the meaning of statements and words, and pragmatic rules. So that's what uses and interpretations of a message are reasonable in a given situation. So those are the subtleties of word meaning. When you were reading the translation from a hotel website that's given in the module, you probably noticed violations of all of those rules. I'll give you a second to read this. So you might have heard a little controversy about different approaches to teaching reading. One being phonics, which is about phonological rules or sounding out words, and the other one is called whole language. And in whole language, they're really basing the approach on this concept, which is you memorize words after seeing them a number of times. You get an imprint of that symbol, and even if it's not exact or correct, you'll still understand where it's going. So in this particular example, it's the context helps us, but also just the first and last letter is all we need to read those words. So that's pretty amazing. Pragmatic rules govern the use and meaning of a statement. So you can say something in one setting, say it to a friend, and it might be totally acceptable, but if you were to say it to an employer, it wouldn't work. So that's the concept of pragmatic rules. We not only have to know what words mean, but we have to know when is it okay to say them. Language is also subjective. So two of us could hear the same statement and take a different meaning from it. And that's partially because language is linked to worldview. Our world experience, how we view things around us, impacts how we interpret language. If you read these phrases and then write down how many minutes you think are indicated in them, you might find it really interesting to ask a few other people. For example, if you have a friend and you say, "Oh, she's so annoying, she's always late," she might not consider a person to be late until about 10 minutes after the scheduled meeting, where you might feel like she's late as soon as she's a minute past when you agreed to meet. So it might not be a sign of disrespect as you might be interpreting it. It might be a different definition of what late is. Language has influence. What you're named or what you name things, for example, if you opened a childcare center and chose a name, naming helps shape identity, how people perceive you. Language contributes to credibility and status, so how people perceive you is in terms of whether you're trustworthy, or the status they give you, the amount of respect, is based on how you, partially in how you use language. Affiliation, attraction, and interest are all influenced by language. This is a really common area for misunderstanding between men and women. Language has an impact related to power. How people use language to demonstrate power and how we perceive power is very much related to the words we use. Also sexism, sexual prejudice, and racism. Those isms are affected by language. You'll find some interesting examples and illustrations in your text. Sometimes we use language well, sometimes we abuse it. There's diversity in how precise we are and how vague we are in using language. Sometimes people use ambiguous language. They may not intend to, or they may do it to be humorous, or sometimes to avoid lying. It can cause serious misunderstandings. An example of ambiguous language is the word interesting. I had a conversation with someone who was learning the English language, a person from Germany, and we were discussing how the word interesting has a variety of meanings that are not clear in English. So if you were to show me a new haircut and I didn't like it, I might go, "Oh, interesting." Or if you were telling me a story about something you did at work and I didn't agree, I didn't think that you handled it well, I might go, "Oh, interesting." So I explained to her that the word interesting often doesn't mean that you're at all interested in what's going on. You're choosing an ambiguous word because you don't want to say, "I don't like your haircut," or "I don't think you handled that well." This diagram is called the abstraction ladder. And what it is at the top there's very abstract language. So if you say to someone, "You need to have a better attitude," that's pretty vague. If you want to be really specific, you move further down the ladder, and finally you would say, "You need to quit complaining every time we have to work late or come in on weekends." So the more precise you are, the clearer your meaning is just to another person. Yet we tend to often be quite abstract, kind of lazy with our language. We use euphemisms. So that is an example of substituting a softer term for a blunt one. So sometimes if a person is not doing a good job at work, you wouldn't want to say to them, "Well, you're incompetent." Or hopefully you wouldn't want to say that. You'd probably choose a word like, "Well, you need to work on whatever it is." Or you could use improvement in something else. So we soften unpleasant messages. Relative language is the idea that we give extra meaning to words by using comparison. So words like large, like small, they give an additional meaning to the words that we use. Static evaluation is a concept that people are static, and static means the same. So if you are influenced by static evaluation, you think that people and things are consistent, never change. And the same with language. You're unaware of the diversity or the range that can be indicated. When you're working in human services, you're definitely going to be thinking about the language of responsibility. So you'll be reading about this, of course, more in your text. But if you say "I" instead of "it," so you want to be clear that it's you, your perspective, something that you did that you're talking about, not something general. "Well, it happened." Well, maybe you should be saying "I did it." Using but statements. Sometimes when you're trying to get a person to be clear, they'll say something, but then they'll immediately follow with a "but." So it's a way of kind of avoiding responsibility. If you say "you," if you use "you" a lot, "you did this," "you did that," it can carry a message of judgment. Where if you use language more shaped around "we" or "I," you're sharing ownership, or you're taking ownership and responsibility of the message that you're giving. Language can be disruptive. Sometimes we experience things like fact and opinion confusion. A person says something as if it was a fact, but actually it was an opinion. And because they didn't label it accurately, they didn't say, well, this is what I think, you might think it was a fact and believe something that actually was never true. There's also confusion about facts and inferences. A good example in our field is when you do observations of children. So if you make an inferential statement, what you're doing is you're coming to a conclusion that has been interpreted by you. It's better to just describe behavior, describe facts, and then if you're going to form an inference, you need to be clear that you're saying, I believe it means whatever, and this is why. This is why I think that, rather than stating it as a fact. So rather than saying a child was crying because another child took their toy, if you weren't there for the whole exchange, what might be happening is the child might be crying, but maybe they were hit. Maybe someone hit them and you just didn't see it. Emotive language is language that seems to describe something, but it actually really announces how a person feels. Sometimes people use emotive language when they don't really feel comfortable coming right out and directly giving their feeling. So this is often done just in the tone of voice as well. So you might say something like, wow, she talks a lot. So when I say that, I'm really just saying a person is talkative. But the way I delivered it, the way I said it, gives a pretty clear indication that I think she talks too much. Culture has a big impact on language. Translation, as in the example you saw earlier in the module, words can have different meanings in different languages. And word choice can be less straightforward than it seems. That would be like my example of the word interesting. Lots of cultural differences in that, and we also use different idioms. So idioms are those kind of sayings that we've gotten used to, that a person that doesn't speak our language would have no clue what we're talking about, would really wonder what we are trying to get at or what we are describing. If you say something like, well, I'll be a monkey's uncle, if you said that, I would know that you were really surprised, right? But how would someone that wasn't familiar with our language come to that conclusion? Because nothing about that phrase indicates surprise. It's just a pretty strange saying. Your text talks about high versus low context cultures. This is really important to know when you're communicating with colleagues, coworkers, parents who have different cultural backgrounds. If you're from a low context culture, you would express your ideas as directly and logically as possible. That's fairly common of North American speech patterns. We're not perfectly clear, but we're pretty clear. A high context culture, this is often what you would find in an Asian country, relies more on subtleties, so nonverbal cues or a softening of language is designed to create harmony or keep harmony at the expense of directness. So if you're talking to someone from a high context culture, you may miss their meaning because it wasn't direct enough for you. You didn't pick it up because you weren't looking for the underlying messages or nonverbal cues. There's great diversity within culture in terms of directness and indirectness, how elaborate you are or how succinct you are, and how formal and informal you are. Another example related to the German language is that in Germany it's very common to call people by either Mr. or Mrs. If I was speaking even to my neighbor, I would call him Herr Johnston. I wouldn't call him, which is Mr. I wouldn't call him by his first name, Dan. This is especially important in a work environment. And it isn't until you're invited to be more casual that you use more casual language. And it's not just the Mr. and Mrs. There's actually different uses of you. So the choice of the word you, whether you use the choice, which is the word see, or you choose the word do, they both mean you, but they indicate a level of formality in the relationship that you have with the other person. We don't have that here, but we certainly have a lot of other little things that will indicate very quickly to speakers of English in Canada whether you are close to or how formal you are with other people. I'm sure that the way that you talk to your instructors is different than the way you talk to your friends. Your text also has interesting reading about gender and language. And what it says is that between genders, we differ in terms of the content, what men or women prefer to talk about, the reasons we choose to communicate and the amount that we talk, what our style is like. So very different conversations happening between men, groups of men, or groups of women. And certainly you'll find that if you're in a mixed group of people, very often males and females divide out because they're not really interested in the same conversations. However, that is a bit of a stereotype, and research says that there are other variables not related to sex that are just as important. So for example, your social philosophy, your sexual orientation, your occupation, how you view problem solving, your gender roles, the level of power you have, all of those are things that may actually have a stronger impact on language than gender. Lots of interesting ideas in your readings in the listening or in the language chapter.